My father did not slam the table. He simply stood up midway through Thanksgiving dinner, raised a white envelope in front of 30 relatives, and called me a thief in a chillingly calm voice. My mother started weeping right on cue. What the room did not know was that I brought my own envelope. It was thicker, heavier, and about to burn their entire fabricated lives to the ground. My name is Amelia Simmons, and I am 34 years old. To understand the precise temperature of the room when the trap was finally sprung, you have to picture the dining room at Aunt Darlene Pruitt's house in the heart of Alder Creek, nestled deep within Belmere County. It was Thanksgiving, traditionally a time for strained gratitude and overcooked poultry, but tonight the air was thick with something far more toxic. Darlene had shoved 3 long, heavy oak tables together to accommodate just over 30 relatives. The spread was ostentatious. Roasted turkeys, bowls of buttery mashed potatoes, and green bean casseroles fought for space among crystal wine glasses and polished silverware. The clatter of forks against porcelain was deafening, a chaotic symphony of a family pretending everything was perfectly normal. I sat near the middle of the second table, radiating an unnatural calm. At my feet, pushed entirely out of sight beneath the hem of the tablecloth, rested a heavy, structured leather bag. No one paid it any mind. No one ever paid attention to the quiet things I did, which was exactly what I was counting on. In my daily life, I work as a senior administrative coordinator at Briar Glen Health Network. My job involves managing high-stakes medical logistics, decoding labyrinthine insurance disputes, and absorbing the panic of patients and doctors alike. I am paid to stay calm when everyone else starts panicking. That professional stoicism was my armor tonight. At the head of the ad hoc banquet table sat my father, Randall Simmons. He did not look like a man preparing to carve a bird and offer thanks for the harvest. He was dressed in a charcoal wool suit, perfectly tailored, with a crisp ivory shirt and a tie that screamed corporate litigation rather than familial warmth. His posture was rigid, his chin tilted at an angle that demanded total submission. He was not acting like a father hosting a holiday meal. He was carrying himself like a chairman of the board preparing to preside over a disciplinary hearing, a public tribunal meant to execute a single, carefully chosen target. To his immediate right sat my mother, Patrice Simmons. If Randall was the iron fist, Patrice was the velvet glove soaked in theatrical sorrow. The main course had barely been served. Not a single confrontational word had been uttered, yet she was already dabbing the corners of her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. She sniffled softly, just loud enough for the aunts and cousins nearby to hear, and lean in with hushed, concerned murmurs. It was a masterclass in preemptive victimhood. She was planting the seeds of a tragedy, making sure the jury was emotionally primed before the prosecutor even made his opening statement. For weeks, a vicious, invisible poison had been seeping through the phone lines and text threads of the Simmons family. The whispers were always the same, carefully cultivated and strategically leaked by my parents. They said I had taken advantage of my grandmother, Beatrice, in her final, fragile days. They said I had siphoned away a massive sum of money before she passed away. I could feel the weight of those rumors pressing against my skin as I chewed my food. The relatives who usually greeted me with tight hugs at the front door had offered only stiff nods this evening. My cousins avoided making eye contact, suddenly fascinated by the cranberry sauce whenever my gaze drifted their way. I was the ghost at the feast, the accused thief waiting for the guillotine to drop. Slowly, the ambient noise in the room began to die. The scraping of knives, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of 30 voices sharing mundane updates about weather and sports faded into a suffocating silence. Randall had placed his fork down. The metallic clink rang out like a judge striking a gavel. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his suit jacket. The entire room held its collective breath. From the inside pocket of his coat, he withdrew a pristine white envelope. He held it up, high enough for the fluorescent dining room lights to catch its stark, unforgiving edges. It looked like a warrant. He cleared his throat, his voice projecting easily across the 3 tables. It was a practiced, somber tone. He looked at Darlene, then at the assorted aunts, uncles, and cousins, before his eyes finally locked onto mine. "Family," Randall began, letting the word hang in the silent air for a dramatic beat. "We gathered here tonight to give thanks, but we cannot move forward into the new year carrying the weight of deception. Tonight, we have to face the truth." Patrice let out a perfectly timed, muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. Every single pair of eyes in the room snapped away from Randall and slammed directly into me. 30 faces, a mix of morbid curiosity, preemptive disgust, and shock, stared at the 34-year-old woman sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to turn pale, to start stammering out a pathetic denial, to burst into tears, or to push my chair back and flee into the cold November night. They expected guilt. They demanded a spectacle of shame. I gave them nothing of the sort. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. Instead, I looked directly into my father's eyes, past the white envelope he wielded like a sword, and I smiled. It was not a wide, manic grin. It was a fraction of a smile, a slight upward curve of my lips, a terrifyingly serene acknowledgement of his move. It was the smile of someone who had spent months memorizing the enemy's playbook and had already planted landmines on their side of the field. I saw the exact second the script broke in Randall's mind. His commanding glare faltered, his jaw tightened, and the hand holding the envelope gave a microscopic twitch. He had anticipated rage or fear. He had not anticipated cold, crystalline amusement. He did not know about the heavy leather bag resting against my ankle. He did not know that his public execution was actually an ambush I had patiently allowed him to walk into. To understand why I could sit in the crosshairs of 30 judgmental relatives and smile at the man trying to destroy my life, we have to rewind the clock. The genesis of this Thanksgiving massacre did not start with the turkey being carved, nor did it begin with the white envelope in my father's trembling hand. It started 7 months ago, in the sterile, quiet aftermath of my grandmother's death. It started with a suffocating, parasitic financial obligation that bore my name, a debt that had been slowly bleeding me dry for nearly a decade. For 9 years, I had been the silent, dutiful daughter, sacrificing my own future to prop up their illusions of grandeur. But when Beatrice took her final breath, the delicate ecosystem of lies my parents had built began to destabilize. They knew I was finally going to demand my freedom. They knew that if I pulled my name off their precarious financial house of cards, the entire structure would collapse, exposing the rot underneath. And so, my father did what he always did when his survival was threatened. He went on the offensive. He decided that the only way to keep me chained to his sinking ship was to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that no one would ever believe a single word I said. He thought the rumors would break me. He thought the public humiliation of this dinner would force me back into submission. But as I sat there, watching his confidence crack behind that slight falter of his hand, I knew the truth. This was not a trial where I was the defendant. This was a demolition site, and my father had just handed me the detonator. 9 years ago, I was 25 years old and fueled by the kind of relentless, naive optimism that only exists before your own blood relatives weaponize it against you. I was working 50 to 60 hours a week, splitting my time between a grueling entry-level healthcare administration job and weekend shifts doing data entry. Every spare dollar I earned went straight into a high-yield savings account. I had a vision board taped to the back of my closet door featuring modest, single-family homes with wraparound porches and small backyards. I wanted a mortgage. I wanted a piece of the world that was entirely mine, built on my own sweat. That was when my parents came to my cramped one-bedroom apartment with a bottle of cheap wine and a meticulously rehearsed pitch. They had found a property on the outskirts of town, an aging but picturesque estate they wanted to transform into the Cedar Lantern Lodge. It was meant to be a premier wedding venue, capitalizing on the rustic chic trend that was sweeping through the bridal magazines. Randall had the vision. Patrice had the decorative flair. But what they did not have was the credit history to secure the commercial lease and the renovation loans. They had overleveraged themselves on failed ventures in the past, a detail they conveniently glossed over during their presentation. They needed a co-signer, a commercial guarantor. They sat on my thrift store sofa, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. My father promised, swearing on his life, that it would only be for 6 months. Just a temporary bridge to get the doors open and the first season of bridal deposits banked. My mother held my hands, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, talking about how this was the family's legacy, how this venue would provide for all of us in the future. They made it sound like I was holding the key to our collective salvation. All I had to do was sign my name on a few lines of paperwork. I signed. It was the most expensive mistake of my adult life. Those promised 6 months evaporated. 6 months bled into a year, then 3 years, then 5. The Cedar Lantern Lodge opened, and the wedding photos looked beautiful on social media, but the financial reality was a sinking ship. The commercial guarantee did not just stay on a piece of paper in a banker's filing cabinet. It anchored itself deep into my credit file like a rusted meat hook. Whenever I walked into a bank, proud of my down payment savings and my solid salary at the health network, ready to finally apply for a home loan, the underwriter would run my social security number. The smile would drop from their face. They would slide my paperwork back across the desk and explain that my debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic. On paper, I was legally responsible for the entirety of a struggling commercial enterprise. I was carrying the weight of hundreds of thousands of dollars in contingent liability. I was a walking financial hazard. Denied. Again and again. Denied. Every time a rejection letter arrived in the mail. I would drive out to the lodge. I would sit in Randall's chaotic office, the walls plastered with wedding schedules, and beg him to refinance. I begged him to find another backer, to release my name so I could start my own life. The response was always a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Randall would immediately drop his pen, his posture stiffening as he adopted the role of the deeply wounded patriarch. He would raise his voice just enough to dominate the room, asking how I could be so selfish when they were working their fingers to the bone to build something for our family name. If I pushed harder, Patrice would materialize in the doorway. She never yelled. She simply wept. She would clutch her chest and ask where she went wrong as a mother to raise a daughter so transactional, so devoid of familial loyalty. They twisted my desire for basic financial independence into an act of profound betrayal. I retreated every single time, suffocated by the guilt they so expertly manufactured, but the trap was growing tighter. I eventually discovered that my father was not just struggling to make the monthly payments. He was actively digging a deeper grave. Without consulting me, Randall had exploited a loophole in the original operating agreement to quietly restructure the business debt. He rolled vendor arrears and short-term, high-interest loans into the primary commercial umbrella. He increased the principal burden massively, because my name was still fundamentally tied to the master guarantee. My phantom debt skyrocketed overnight. I found out not from him, but through the automated fraud alerts on my phone. Then came the emails from credit monitoring bureaus. My score dropped by 40 points in a single month, then another 20 points. The toll it took on my daily life was agonizing. At work, I managed multi-million-dollar budgets for the hospital with flawless precision, yet my personal phone would vibrate in my pocket at 8 in the morning with automated collection warnings about late payments on the lodge's accounts. I sat at baby showers and housewarming parties for my friends, pasting on a happy face while they gave tours of their new hardwood floors and nursery rooms. I was in my early 30s, trapped in a rental, barred from the middle-class dream I had worked so hard for, all because I was serving as a human meat shield for my parents' vanity project. I realized then that I was not helping my family. I was their hostage. They had no intention of ever letting me go because they could not survive without my pristine financial blood pumping through their diseased business. I ground my teeth and survived the anxiety attacks for years, clinging to the hope that maybe the next wedding season would be the turning point. But the breaking point finally arrived with the death of my grandmother, Beatrice. She passed away after a short, confusing stint in a rehabilitation center, The grief of losing her was a heavy blow, but it also brought a sudden, blinding clarity. Standing at her graveside, watching the dirt fall over her casket, I looked at my parents acting the part of the devastated mourners. I realized life was entirely too short to spend it carrying the crushing weight of their failures. Beatrice had always told me to protect myself, a warning I had failed to understand until it was too late. The week after the funeral, I drove to the lodge, bypassed the theatrical tears and the booming guilt trips, and laid a formal document on Randall's desk. It was an absolute demand. I gave them exactly 60 days to refinance the Cedar Lantern Lodge and remove me as the commercial guarantor, or I would force a legal dissolution of the original agreement, a move that would trigger an immediate call on the loan and likely bankrupt them. I thought I was finally standing up for myself. I thought I was drawing a healthy, necessary boundary. What I did not realize was that I had just backed a desperate animal into a corner. Randall looked at the paper, then looked up at me, and I saw something cold and terrifying click behind his eyes. That demand was the spark. He knew that if I pulled my name, the bank would audit the lodge's true financial health, and the entire structure of lies he was standing on would collapse into dust. He realized he could not simply argue with me anymore. He had to annihilate me. He had to make sure that by the time I tried to blow the whistle on his financial ruin, my reputation would be so thoroughly destroyed, so deeply stained with scandal, that no one, not the bank, not the lawyers, and certainly not our family, would believe a single word out of my mouth. Alder Creek is the kind of town where a secret can suffocate you long before the truth ever sees the light of day. It is a place built on manicured lawns, Sunday morning congregations, and an intricate, invisible network of whispers. In a community like this, a rumor does not need the sturdy foundation of evidence to destroy a life. It only needs a compelling narrator. My father was a master storyteller, and I was entirely unprepared for the narrative he unleashed in the wake of my grandmother's death. Beatrice Simmons spent the final weeks of her life at Maple Haven Recovery House. It was a sterile, quietly depressing facility on the north side of the county, smelling perpetually of lemon disinfectant and boiled vegetables. Her physical decline was rapid, a cascade of failing systems that left her bedridden and disoriented. When she finally passed away, the grief I felt was profound and exhausting. I had spent countless evenings sitting beside her narrow institutional bed, holding her fragile, paper-thin hand, listening to her drift in and out of lucid memories. I thought those quiet vigils were a private sanctuary of grief. I did not know they were being cataloged as evidence for my own prosecution. The campaign began almost immediately after the funeral. The family had gathered for a somber reception, drinking lukewarm coffee and picking at catered sandwiches. It was there, amidst the muted condolences, that Randall planted the first toxic seed. He did not stand on a chair and shout an accusation. He was far too calculating for that. Instead, he cornered small groups of aunts, uncles, and second cousins near the refreshment table, keeping his voice pitched low, adopting the heavy, broken tone of a son who had just discovered a terrible betrayal. He told them that while sorting through Beatrice's final affairs, he had uncovered a devastating financial discrepancy. A massive portion of her life savings, money explicitly designated for her end-of-life care, had been systematically siphoned from her accounts during her final year. When my relatives gasped and asked how such a thing could happen, Randall would simply shake his head, his eyes shining with unshed, manufactured tears. He never spoke my name in connection with the missing funds. He merely offered a series of highly specific, damning observations. He mentioned how confusing modern banking was for the elderly. He pointed out that Beatrice could barely operate a television remote, let alone navigate wire transfers. Then, with surgical precision, he would add how fortunate it was that I had been there so often to help her with her phone. He reminded everyone that I was the one who bought her an iPad, that I was the one who sat with her for hours, that I was the only person in the family who truly understood how to access those digital portals. He left the pieces on the table and let human nature do the rest. He knew that in a town like Alder Creek, an implication is far more contagious than a direct charge. Within 72 hours, The insinuation had mutated into undisputed fact. The Whisper Network had not only convicted me, but it had also conjured a highly specific figure out of thin air. The rumor surging through the bloodlines of the Simmons family was that I had manipulated a dying, confused old woman into handing over exactly $92,400. The social quarantine fell over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. People who had known me since I was a toddler suddenly forgot how to look me in the eye. On my first Sunday back at Grace Fellowship, the shift in the atmosphere was physical. The older women who usually enveloped me in suffocating, perfume-heavy hugs now offered tight, uncomfortable nods from a safe distance. Conversations would abruptly halt the moment I walked into the church foyer. I caught my cousin darting her eyes away from me, her expression a mix of morbid fascination and deep disgust. They were looking at me not as a grieving granddaughter, but as a predator who had yet to be fitted for handcuffs. The isolation was meant to break me, but it was the breach of my professional life that truly sent a spike of pure ice through my veins. It happened on a Tuesday morning at Briar Glen Health Network. I was in the break room, staring blankly at the coffee machine, when a senior billing coordinator named Evelyn stepped in. Evelyn was practically an institution at the hospital, known for her sharp competence and her extensive family ties throughout Belmere County. She poured her coffee in silence, but the air between us was fraught. As I turned to leave, she cleared her throat. She did not look at me. She focused intently on stirring artificial sweetener into her mug. In a voice that was carefully stripped of any emotion, she mentioned that her sister-in-law attended Grace Fellowship. She paused, letting the geographical connection hang in the air, before asking if I needed any adjustments to my schedule because she had heard I might be facing some complicated legal trouble. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Legal trouble. The rumor had grown legs, marched out of the family living rooms, and walked right through the automatic sliding doors of my workplace. Standing in that break room, gripping a paper cup so hard the coffee nearly spilled over the brim, the entire architecture of my parents' strategy finally clicked into place. This was not merely an act of petty vindictiveness. This was a preemptive strike. They knew the ultimatum I had given them regarding their commercial debt was ticking down. They knew I was preparing to force their hand, an action that would expose their catastrophic financial ruin. By blanketing the town with the story of the stolen $92,400, they were building a massive, impenetrable firewall around themselves. They were ensuring that when I finally blew the whistle on their fraudulent business practices, I would not look like a victim trying to escape a financial hostage situation. I would look like a desperate, cornered thief trying to extort her grieving parents to cover up her own crimes. Who would believe a woman who robbed her dying grandmother? It was a flawless, psychopathic defensive maneuver. I retreated to my office, locked the door, and sat in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt entirely trapped in a narrative I could not disprove. How do you prove a negative? How do you show a town a bank statement for a transaction that never existed? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to picture Beatrice's face, trying to find some anchor in the storm of lies. I thought about the hours I spent with her in that recovery house. I thought about the iPad I had indeed bought her, hoping she could use it to look at family photos. Then, a memory surfaced, sharp and brilliant, cutting through the panic. It was a memory from 2 years prior, sitting at Beatrice's worn Formica kitchen table. I had been trying to teach her how to log into her checking account online so she would not have to drive in the snow to check her balance. The sheer terror in her eyes had been absolute. Beatrice was a woman who kept her savings passbooks locked in a fireproof box. She believed the internet was a lawless void where invisible hands could reach through the screen and empty her pockets. She had become so agitated by the digital banking interface that she had literally pushed the laptop across the table, demanding I close it. She had adamantly, aggressively refused to ever link her bank accounts to the internet. She paid every single utility bill, every grocery delivery, every medical copay, by walking into the physical branch of the county bank and handing over a paper check written in her shaky, cursive handwriting. She did not possess a debit card. She did not know what a routing number was. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My father's entire rumor rested on the premise that I had used my technological savvy to silently siphon money out of her accounts via her phone or tablet. But if Beatrice's accounts were completely disconnected from the digital world, if it was technologically impossible to move her funds through an app or an online portal, then the money could not have vanished quietly into the ether. If $92,400 had actually been removed from her physical bank branch, it had to have left a massive, undeniable paper trail. It required physical signatures. It required withdrawal slips. It required a physical presence. The suffocating grip of the town's judgment suddenly felt irrelevant. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical anger. The trap my parents had built for me was intricate, but they had made a fatal error in its construction. They had forgotten who my grandmother actually was. And in doing so, they had given me the exact thread I needed to pull to unravel their entire lives. The morning after I realized the fundamental flaw in the accusations against me, I did not confront anyone. I did not make a single phone call to my parents, nor did I attempt to defend myself to the aunts and uncles who had already served as my judge and jury. Instead, I went directly to the Belmere County Courthouse. I walked into the probate clerk's office, took a number, and waited in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room. When my turn came, I filed a formal, legally binding request for full, unredacted access to the estate records and all corresponding financial ledger activities tied to Beatrice's accounts. As a direct descendant and a named beneficiary in her original will, I possessed the absolute legal right to examine the paper trail of the estate settlement process. It took exactly 14 days for the thick, heavy manila envelope to arrive in my locked mailbox. That night, I cleared everything off my dining room table. I made a pot of black coffee, turned on the harsh overhead light, and spread the bank statements out like pieces of a gruesome jigsaw puzzle. I was looking for a ghost, but what I found was a highly orchestrated corporate looting. The numbers told a story that completely decimated the frantic, emotional narrative circulating through our family. The funds had not vanished in a sudden, panicked digital sweep, which is what one would expect from a greedy relative grabbing cash in the middle of the night. Instead, the money had been bled out methodically over a period of 8 months. I tracked the outbound column line by line. There were cashier checks drawn for even amounts, structured wire transfers that deliberately fell just beneath the federal reporting thresholds, and automated clearinghouse payments. This was not the erratic thievery of a granddaughter. This was a systematic, disciplined liquidation. I took a yellow highlighter and began tracing the destination of the outflows. A massive portion of the missing funds had been funneled to a series of obscure, unfamiliar legal entities. One company name appeared repeatedly, catching the harsh glare of the overhead light, Red Hollow Hospitality Services. I had never heard of this vendor. My grandmother certainly had no business with a hospitality service. I opened my laptop and ran the name through the state business registry database. The search results loaded instantly. It was a limited liability company, registered a mere 11 months prior. I pulled up the official billing address listed on the state charter and typed it into a digital map. The red destination pin dropped onto a dilapidated, nearly vacant commercial strip exactly 3.2 miles down the main highway from my parents' wedding venue. Red Hollow Hospitality Services was not a real vendor providing medical care for an elderly woman. It was a phantom bucket. It was a shell company designed explicitly to catch the runoff from Beatrice's life savings and launder it quietly down the road. But the most damning piece of evidence was buried near the bottom of the probate stack. It was a photocopy of a durable financial power of attorney. The document explicitly granted full, unmitigated control of all banking assets, real estate, and medical directives to my father. It was dated a mere 5 weeks before she passed away. I pulled the document closer, my eyes locking onto the signature line at the bottom of the second page. The blue ink formed the letters of my grandmother's name, and at first glance, it possessed the jagged, wavering quality of a severely ailing 82-year-old woman. But I had spent 3 decades reading her birthday cards and thank you notes. I knew the specific, aggressive slant of her cursive. The signature on this legal document was shaky, yes, but it was far too aesthetically pleasing. It was a highly controlled, deliberate tremor, real physiological tremors, the kind induced by heavy medication and failing neurological systems. Do not yield perfectly spaced, symmetrical loops. Furthermore, the final stroke of the letter E in Beatrice curled upward in a neat, delicate little flourish. My grandmother always dragged her final letters sharply downward, heavily indenting the paper, a habit born from decades of writing with heavy fountain pens in her youth. Someone had practiced this signature. Someone had sat at a desk, held a pen, and deliberately made their hand shake while carefully tracing the letters of her name. I shifted my focus to the bottom left corner of the page, where the notary public had stamped their official seal, validating the allegedly witnessed signature. I squinted at the faint, circular ink mark. The name was perfectly legible, along with the commission expiration date printed just beneath the emblem. I opened a new tab on my browser and accessed the state secretary's official notary database. I typed in the name and the corresponding registration number. The system processed the request and returned a bright red text box. The commission for that specific notary had officially expired 7 full months before the date typed on the power of attorney. The stamp was dead. The document was legally void, validated by a piece of rubber that had likely been borrowed or stolen from a dusty desk drawer to legitimize a forged document. The final puzzle piece required a physical trip back to the north side of the county. The following Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the rehabilitation center. The receptionist at the front desk was a young woman I had befriended during those long, exhausting evening visits with Beatrice. I brought her a box of fresh bakery pastries and casually asked if I could look through the physical visitor logbooks from the previous fall. I cited a mundane need to reconstruct a timeline for the estate tax attorneys. She handed over the heavy, leather-bound binder without a single question. I flipped back through the heavy pages, scanning the columns of messy handwriting and smeared ink. I was looking for 2 very specific dates. These were the exact 2 days my father had loudly claimed to his siblings that I had locked myself in the room with Beatrice, allegedly pressuring and manipulating her into handing over her assets. I found the dates. I ran my index finger down the long sign-in sheets. My name was nowhere to be found. But I did not rely solely on a piece of paper in a lobby. I pulled my phone from my pocket and logged directly into the hospital's secure employee portal. I navigated to my own archived payroll timesheets. On the first date in question, the system showed I had clocked in at the health network at 6 in the morning and clocked out at 7 in the evening. On the second date, I had worked a mandatory 14-hour emergency shift, managing patient intake during a massive local crisis on the interstate. I had digital, geolocated, and payroll-verified proof that I was standing in an emergency room miles away when the supposed coercion took place. I walked out of the facility and sat in my car in the empty parking lot. The photocopies rested on the passenger seat, heavy and undeniable. The chill in the cabin had nothing to do with the weather outside. The reality of the situation settled over me, wrapping around my throat. This was no longer just a case of malicious family gossip. This was not merely a desperate, failing businessman telling tall tales to his relatives to save face and deflect blame. This was a calculated, multi-step criminal conspiracy. My parents had orchestrated a systemic embezzlement of an elderly woman's estate. They had forged legal instruments, utilized dead notary seals, fabricated a paper trail, and set up phantom vendor accounts to siphon the money. And they had done all of this while simultaneously constructing a flawless, airtight narrative designed to frame me for the entire operation. They had not just thrown me under the bus, they had meticulously built a prison cell with my name engraved on the bars, loaded the gun, and waited for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. They wanted me destroyed, not just discredited. From that moment on, I knew I was no longer fighting to clear my name. I was preparing for an execution. I realized very quickly that gathering raw, unredacted documents from a county probate clerk was merely the foundation of a defense. To build a guillotine, I needed professionals who knew exactly how to sharpen the blade. I did not need a standard family attorney who would bill me by the hour just to send stern, ultimately useless letters of cease and desist. I needed people who dismantled sophisticated lies for a living. I needed predators. My first call was to Mara Cates. In our region, Mara was something of a dark legend in the financial sector. She was a specialized forensic accountant who made her living dissecting messy corporate divorces, untangling inheritance theft, and hunting down assets that arrogant people believed they had successfully hidden. She did not look at money as a concept. She looked at it as a behavioral footprint. Her office was stripped of warmth, featuring nothing but whiteboards, locking filing cabinets, and the faint smell of dry erase markers. I hired her on the spot, handing over the heavy stack of bank ledgers and probate filings. I gave her one simple directive: find out exactly where the blood was flowing. Simultaneously, I secured the services of Ellis Ward. Ellis was a board-certified document examiner and digital forensics specialist. He was a quiet, meticulous man who lived inside the microscopic fibers of paper and the invisible digital footprints left behind by careless criminals. I provided him with the photocopies of the durable financial power of attorney and the stack of healthcare caregiving invoices my parents had been waving around to their siblings as proof of my supposed theft. For 2 weeks, I continued going to work at the hospital, managing patient logistics and maintaining a mask of total, unbroken calm while my own family treated me like a leper. Behind the scenes, Mara and Ellis were systematically tearing my parents' fictional universe down to the studs. When Mara finally called me back into her office for a review, she had mapped out the entire financial ecosystem on a massive whiteboard using a web of black and red lines. The sheer audacity of what she had uncovered took my breath away. The money, she explained in her sharp, clinical voice, had not disappeared into the void. It had not been withdrawn in panicked, untraceable cash sums. Instead, almost the entirety of my grandmother's missing funds had been funneled directly into the gaping, bleeding wounds of the Cedar Lantern Lodge. Mara had pierced the veil of the phantom vendor I had found earlier, tracing the routing numbers right past the shell company and straight into my father's commercial operating accounts. Mara tapped the board with the back of her pen, highlighting the most egregious expenditures. There was a massive 5-figure wire transfer authorized precisely 2 days before the county tax assessor's absolute final deadline, saving the lodge from imminent property seizure. There was an exorbitant payment made to an overseas vendor to import a set of massive, custom-cut crystal chandeliers for the primary wedding reception hall. There were thousands of dollars siphoned off just to bridge the payroll deficit for the catering staff during the dead of winter, a season when bridal bookings historically dropped to zero. The most sickening discovery was an emergency: expedited payment made to a commercial HVAC company. The invoice was for the immediate repair and upgrade of a high-capacity refrigeration system located in the lodge's wine cellar. Mara laid the commercial invoices on the table next to my grandmother's final medical charts. She looked at me, her expression entirely devoid of humor. She pointed out that unless my dying grandmother was receiving her palliative care while locked inside a commercial wine cooler under a crystal chandelier, not a single cent of this money had gone toward her comfort or survival. It was a corporate bailout funded by the life savings of an 82-year-old woman. The following afternoon, I met with Ellis Ward. If Mara had tracked the weapon, Ellis had found the fingerprints on the trigger. He started with the power of attorney. My father had not just forged the signature, he had been astonishingly, arrogantly sloppy with the digital execution of the lie. Ellis had extracted the underlying metadata from the scanned PDF file that my father had submitted to the probate court. He explained the concept to me in simple, devastating terms. Every digital file carries an invisible birth certificate, a permanent record of its own creation. The creation date embedded deep inside that specific legal document was exactly 2 months and 14 days after the date typed at the top of the page. Even worse, the metadata contained the specific hardware identifiers of the machine that generated the file. The document had not been drafted at a law firm or a notary's office. It had been created on a desktop computer operating on a private residential network. It had been created on a desktop connected to my father's home office network. He had manufactured the legal shield in his own house, long after Beatrice was already dead and buried, right when he realized he needed legal cover to explain the empty bank accounts. Then, Ellis slid a folder across the desk containing the invoices for the in-home care. These were the documents Randall had used to poison the family against me, claiming they were the exorbitant medical bills I had supposedly intercepted and hidden. The bills were printed on professional letterhead, detailing hundreds of hours of bedside monitoring provided by a private contract nurse named Sharon Vale. Ellis had run the corresponding state nursing license number printed at the bottom of the invoices through the State Medical Board's comprehensive regulatory database. The search returned a direct hit, but not for anyone named Sharon Vale. The license number actually belonged to a specialized pediatric physical therapist who had retired 15 years ago and currently resided 3 states away. Sharon Vale did not exist. She was a ghost. She was a completely fictional character my parents had invented, complete with a fake hourly rate, to justify the massive, recurring withdrawals they were funneling into their failing wedding venue. Listening to these two experts outline the absolute, undeniable proof of my parents' crimes did not make me feel triumphant. I did not experience a rush of vindication or a sudden surge of adrenaline. As I sat in those sterile, quiet offices, absorbing the reality of the paperwork, the only sensation I felt was a creeping, paralyzing cold. It started at the base of my spine and slowly wrapped around my ribs, freezing the air in my lungs. The level of sociopathy required to execute this plan was entirely beyond my comprehension. They had watched my grandmother wither away in a standardized recovery bed, and instead of mourning the woman who gave them life, they had viewed her as an unattended vault. They had viewed her death as a convenient final line of credit. Then, without missing a beat, they had sat across from me at Sunday dinners, asking about my job, smiling at my face, fully knowing they were building a trapdoor under my feet and preparing to pull the lever. The sadness I had been carrying evaporated, leaving behind something hard, permanent, and utterly unforgiving. I was done being the silent victim of their narrative. I was done hoping that reason or familial love would suddenly awaken within them. If I was going to reclaim my name, my destroyed credit score, and my future, I could not just whisper the truth to a few sympathetic cousins in the corner of a church foyer. I could not rely on half measures or emotional pleas. I had to execute a public, undeniable demolition. I had to obliterate my father's lie so thoroughly, so cleanly, that he would never be able to twist the narrative again. It had to be documented. It had to be irrefutable. And most importantly, it had to happen right in front of the exact audience he had spent weeks poisoning against me. I was going to wait for him to build his stage, and then I was going to burn it to the ground with him standing on it, leaving him absolutely no exit and no quarter. The forensic paperwork provided the lethal, undeniable proof of the financial crime, but documents alone are cold. They show how a theft was executed, but they do not capture the human collateral left bleeding in the wake of the fraud. To truly understand the depths of my parents' deception, I had to look beyond the bank ledgers. I had to look at the people my father had systematically pushed to the fringes of our family, the voices he had silenced to maintain his pristine, authoritative image. The first person I sought out was Jolene Mercer. She was my grandmother's distant cousin, a sharp-witted, perceptive woman who had simply evaporated from our family orbit nearly a decade ago. The official family lore, heavily curated and constantly repeated by Randall, dictated that Jolene was a bitter, unstable woman who had caused an unforgivable scene at a summer holiday barbecue and severed ties out of pure spite. I had accepted that story because it was easier than questioning it. I drove out to her small, weather-beaten property on the far edge of the county on a rainy Thursday afternoon. When she opened her front door, she did not look surprised to see me standing on her porch. She looked at my face, stepped aside, and told me she had been wondering exactly how many years it would take for me to finally see the truth. Sitting in her dimly lit living room, surrounded by the smell of old paper and peppermint tea, Jolene dismantled the family myth. The argument all those years ago had nothing to do with a petty slight at a barbecue. Jolene had cornered my father and confronted him directly. She had warned Beatrice, right in front of him, that Randall was using his endless business ventures as a vacuum, sucking dry every financial resource and every piece of goodwill in his vicinity. She had told my grandmother that if she did not cut him off, he would eventually consume everything she had. Randall had retaliated with a vicious smear campaign, isolating Jolene entirely and ensuring no one in the family would ever take her calls again. But Beatrice had known Jolene was right. She had just been too old, too tired, and too desperate for her son's affection to fight a public war. Instead, she had fought a quiet, hidden one. Jolene walked into a back room and returned holding a heavy, battered cardboard box. She placed it on the coffee table and pushed it toward me. Beatrice had secretly asked Jolene to hold on to it for safekeeping, terrified that my father would find it if she kept it in her own house. Inside the box was a small, blue spiral notebook. I opened it and found my grandmother's meticulous, shaky handwriting. She had recorded every single authentic expense from her final years. Tucked between the pages were photocopies of the legitimate checks she had signed. But the most devastating items in the box were the loose scraps of paper. They were hurried, frantic notes Beatrice had written to herself, tiny reminders of her own boundaries. One read, "Do not give Randall another dime for the venue." Another read, "He asked for the savings again. Told him no. Lock the checkbook away." Holding those fragile slips of paper, the tragedy deepened. Beatrice had not been a confused victim drifting into a financial trap. She had known exactly what my father was trying to do, and she had tried to build a fortress against him. She had just run out of time and physical strength. The second unexpected ally emerged through the financial investigation. My forensic accountant had repeatedly flagged the name Tori Bell in the old employee logs. Tori had been the primary bookkeeper for the Cedar Lantern Lodge for 4 years, before being abruptly and unceremoniously terminated. I tracked her down to a quiet diner 2 towns over, hoping she might have some insight into the phantom vendor accounts. Tori was a brilliant, no-nonsense professional who still carried a deep, burning resentment over the destruction of her reputation. Over a cup of black coffee, she explained the real reason she was fired. For months, the lodge had been hemorrhaging cash. They were constantly on the brink of missing payroll or defaulting on massive vendor shipments. Then, magically, right at the precipice of total ruin, Randall would execute what he called internal advances. A massive cashier's check would suddenly appear, clearing the debts just in time to keep the doors open. Tori had done what any competent accountant would do. She demanded a legitimate, auditable paper trail for these mysterious, massive infusions of capital to ensure they were compliant with commercial tax laws. She asked the wrong questions. Randall fired her the very next morning, escorted her off the property, and threatened to ruin her career if she ever spoke about his private ledgers. But Tori was incredibly smart. On her way out the door, knowing she was being wrongfully terminated to cover up a crime, she had made personal backup copies of the raw balance sheets. She slid a thick manila folder across the diner table. I opened it and matched her ledgers against the probate records in my bag. The dates of Randall's miraculous, last-minute cash infusions at the venue aligned flawlessly with the exact days massive withdrawals were pulled from my grandmother's drained accounts. Tori had provided the undeniable bridge between the stolen money and the business. As these external pieces fell into place, the most painful revelation came from inside my own childhood home. My younger brother, Owen, had always been the peacemaker of the family. He was 28 years old, possessing a gentle disposition that made him entirely unequipped to handle our father's domineering rage. Throughout the weeks of my public crucifixion, while the rest of the aunts and uncles gossiped, Owen had remained completely silent. He had stopped calling me. He had stopped coming to my apartment. But the silence was clearly eating him alive. When he finally showed up at my front door late on a Sunday night, he looked physically ill. He had lost weight, his shoulders were slumped, and his hands trembled violently as he paced across my living room rug. He looked like a man carrying a corpse on his back. He finally collapsed onto the sofa and broke down, burying his face in his hands. He confessed that he was carrying a memory he had been desperately trying to repress. Several months prior, late in the evening, he had gone down to our father's home office to borrow a charging cable. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of the computer monitor and the rhythmic humming of the scanner. Owen had walked in and seen Randall standing over the desk. The surface was completely covered in dozens of sheets of blank printer paper. On every single sheet, our father had been practicing. Owen had seen the master copy of Beatrice's signature taped to the desk, and he had watched his father tracing it, repeating the motions over and over again until the forgery was indistinguishable from the original. When Owen had frozen in the doorway, Randall had snapped at him to get out, claiming he was just organizing estate documents. Owen had backed away and forced himself to swallow the lie. He wanted to believe it was legal. He needed to believe his father was not a monster. But as the vicious rumors about me stealing the money began to sweep through the town, the memory of those practice sheets turned into a toxic rot in his stomach. He knew the truth, and his cowardice in the face of my destruction had finally broken his spirit. Sitting next to my weeping brother, holding the notebook from Jolene and the balance sheets from Tori, the entire architecture of my father's lifelong survival strategy became blindingly clear. His greatest weapon was never his business acumen, nor was it his charm. His superpower was extreme, calculated isolation. He survived by ensuring that the people around him never compared their notes. He made Jolene a pariah, so she could never warn the rest of the family. He fired Tori and threatened her so she could never show the books to the bank. He terrified Owen into a paralyzing silence. And he had shackled me with his commercial debt, hoping my shame and desire for a normal family would keep me compliant. He functioned by making every single one of us feel like we were the only persons standing in the dark, the only ones sensing that something was terribly wrong. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. By trying to publicly execute me to cover his tracks, he had forced me to turn on the lights. And now, all the people he had pushed to the edges were finally standing in the same room, holding their pieces of the puzzle, watching the picture form. The scattered, broken victims of his lifelong manipulation were suddenly an organized front, and we were armed to the teeth. The moment the certified mail receipt confirmed my father had signed for the formal 60-day demand letter, the temperature of my world plummeted. I had drafted the document with an attorney, outlining in strict, unambiguous terms that he had exactly 2 months to release my name from the commercial lease, or I would file for forced dissolution. Up until that point, Randall had always relied on theatrical pleading. He had used guilt, heavy sighs, and the heavy burden of family legacy to keep me compliant. But the instant he realized the threat was real and legally binding, the pleading evaporated. He did not call me to negotiate. He called me to declare war. The phone rang at 10 o'clock that evening. I answered it, expecting a barrage of excuses. Instead, his voice was terrifyingly flat. It was a tone devoid of any paternal warmth, stripped down to raw, calculating malice. He told me that if I wanted to play lawyer, he was more than happy to change the rules of the game. He stated, with absolute clarity, that if I did not rescind the letter within 24 hours, he would make sure every single resident, business owner, and churchgoer in our town believed I was the monster who had bled a dying old woman dry. He promised to make my name so toxic that I would not be able to buy a cup of coffee in Belmere County without people spitting in it. Then he hung up. He wasted no time executing his threat. 3 days later, a thick manila envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was stamped with red ink, bearing the words urgent and confidential. Inside was a formal demand for immediate financial restitution. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored paper, complete with a terrifying block of legal jargon demanding the return of the alleged stolen funds. For a brief, agonizing minute, the room spun. The threat of impending litigation felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, but then I forced myself to sit down, steady my breathing, and actually read the words. The panic began to recede, replaced by a sharp, analytical focus. The document was a meticulously crafted piece of theater. It cited state penal codes that did not apply to civil disputes. It lacked a proper court filing number. There was no assigned docket code, no official seal from the county clerk, and no contact information for a registered prosecuting attorney. It was nothing more than a customized template downloaded from the internet, dressed up to look like a death warrant. It was a prop. It was designed to trigger my anxiety and force me to surrender before I realized the gun he was pointing at my head was not even loaded. While Randall orchestrated the pseudo-legal assault, Patrice mobilized her own artillery on the digital front. She turned her social media profiles into a masterclass of passive-aggressive martyrdom. She never typed my name. She did not have to. She began posting daily, vague updates about the unbearable agony of betrayal. She wrote dramatic paragraphs about the pain of discovering that the flesh and blood you raised could harbor such darkness. She shared quotes about greed tearing families apart and posted old, blurry photographs of my grandmother accompanied by captions mourning how Beatrice had been taken advantage of in her final hours. The comment sections beneath her posts became a feeding frenzy. Dozens of aunts, distant cousins, and family friends poured in to offer their prayers and express their disgust at the unnamed perpetrator. I was forced to watch my own social execution in real time, scrolling through the venomous sympathy my mother was harvesting. Every digital notification felt like a small, sharp knife slipping between my ribs. The town was feasting on the narrative, completely blind to the fact that the grieving daughter at the center of the tragedy was actually the architect of the crime. The psychological pressure was excruciating, but the true crisis hit when the fallout finally breached the executive level of my career. The whispers in the break room had escalated. On a Tuesday afternoon, my department head sent a brief message asking me to step into his office. When I closed the door behind me, he did not offer me a seat. He stood behind his desk, his expression a mixture of professional caution and deep discomfort. He chose his words with agonizing care. He stated that the hospital prided itself on the unimpeachable integrity of its administrative staff, especially those of us who handled sensitive logistical budgets. He did not explicitly accuse me of theft, nor did he mention the rumors directly. He did not have to. He simply noted that if a staff member were to become entangled in a severe public financial scandal, the network's board of directors might feel compelled to review that individual's security clearances and ongoing employment status. It was a polite, corporate warning shot. My father's manufactured rumor was no longer just damaging my personal relationships. It was actively threatening to burn down the career I had spent a decade building. The injustice of it all tasted like battery acid in the back of my throat. I left the director's office consumed by a blinding, reckless fury. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march into the hospital lobby, log onto every social media platform, and post the forensic accounting ledgers for the entire world to see. I wanted to burn my parents' reputation to the ground that very afternoon. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage, my hands shaking so violently I could barely unlock my phone. I dialed Mara Cates. The moment she answered, I unleashed a torrent of panic and rage, telling her about the fake legal letter, the social media posts, and the veiled threat to my job. I told her I was going public. I told her I could not survive another day of this suffocating pressure. Mara let me exhaust myself. She listened to my frantic breathing over the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was a bucket of ice water poured directly over my panic. She told me to stop. She commanded me to lock the documents away and keep my mouth completely shut. She explained the fatal flaw in my desire for immediate retaliation. If I released the evidence randomly on the internet or sent it in a frantic email, Randall would have the opportunity to spin it. He would claim I had forged the ledgers to cover my own tracks. He would use his charisma to muddy the waters, dragging me into a protracted, messy public argument where the truth would get lost in the noise. If you want to take down a systematic, pathological liar, Mara said, her tone sharp and unyielding, you do not interrupt him. You have to let him speak loud enough first. You have to let him construct his own stage, walk up the steps himself, and place the spotlight over his own head. You have to let him bring together his own audience. Sitting in the dim light of the parking garage, the chaotic noise in my head suddenly went dead silent. Mara was right. The fake legal letters, the social media melodrama, the rumors seeded throughout the town. They were not just attempts to hurt me, they were a strategic, calculated effort to break my spirit in private. Randall wanted me to shrink away. He wanted the shame to paralyze me so completely that I would drop the 60-day demand and disappear into the shadows, leaving him free to continue his fraud. He wanted a public social execution where I would be too terrified to present a defense. 2 days later, the trap was officially set. An invitation arrived in my inbox from my Aunt Darlene. It was a formal request for my presence at the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner. The message was wrapped in sickeningly sweet language about the importance of family healing, overcoming misunderstandings, and finding a way to move forward in the spirit of gratitude. Anyone else would have read it as a genuine olive branch, but I knew exactly what it was. It was not an invitation to share a meal. It was a summons to the execution block. Randall had gathered the entire family, ensuring every single person who had read the rumors and seen the social media posts would be sitting at those tables. He intended to corner me in front of 30 witnesses, spring his trap, and force me into a total, humiliating surrender. I read the email twice, feeling the cold, hard resolve solidifying in my chest. I typed out a single-word reply, confirming my attendance, and hit send. He wanted an audience for my destruction. I was going to make absolutely sure he got one. Exactly 14 days before the Thanksgiving execution, my phone buzzed with a text from Jolene. It was a single address, located on the far western edge of the county, accompanied by a brief message telling me to meet her there in an hour. I arrived at a sprawling, desolate self-storage facility, bordered by dying pine trees and a rusted chain-link fence. Jolene was already standing outside a roll-up metal door, holding a heavy brass padlock in her gloved hand. She explained that after my grandmother passed, my parents had hastily cleared out her apartment to avoid paying an extra month of rent. They had shoved boxes of what they deemed worthless memorabilia into this climate-controlled unit, promising to sort through it later. Of course, they never did. They only cared about the liquid assets, not the sentimental detritus of an 82-year-old woman's life. Jolene had kept the spare key Beatrice had given her years ago. Heaving the corrugated metal door upward, we were hit by a wave of stagnant, dusty air. The space was crammed with mismatched cardboard boxes, an old sewing machine, and garbage bags full of winter coats. We spent 2 hours sifting through the forgotten remnants of a life. I was looking for anything my father might have missed in his rush to sanitize the paper trail. Near the back of the unit, buried beneath a stack of heavy wool blankets, I found a rusted vintage tin box. The faded painted lid depicted a retro advertisement for pecan pie. It was the kind of container meant to hold loose recipe cards or sewing needles. The hinge shrieked in protest as I pried it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dried vanilla and old paper. Resting at the bottom of the tin was a small, black leather-bound ledger. It was distinct from the daily diary Jolene had given me earlier. This was a dedicated, meticulous accounting log covering the final 18 months of my grandmother's life. I turned the crisp pages, tracing the shaky columns of blue ink. Beatrice had recorded every single check she voluntarily wrote, noting the date, the payee, and the exact dollar amount. I scanned the entries, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked for the dates of the 3 massive withdrawals my father had pinned on me. I looked for the Phantom Shell Company. I looked for the exorbitant payments to the fake pediatric nurse. There was nothing. Not a single entry matched the fraudulent transactions. Instead, the margins of the ledger were filled with small, frantic annotations. Beatrice had used the edges of the paper to document her escalating terror. Next to a perfectly normal grocery entry, she had written, "R asked for the venue money again today." A few pages later, heavily underlined, the ink read, "Do not sign any paperwork while taking the heavy pain medication." Another note simply said, "He will not leave my room until I agree." The ledger alone was a devastating piece of evidence, proving her state of mind. But the true artifact of my father's destruction was hiding beneath a folded linen napkin at the very bottom of the pecan pie tin. It was a silver, handheld digital voice recorder. The casing was scratched, and the buttons were worn down. Beatrice had suffered from tremors that grew progressively worse in her final year. When holding a pen became too exhausting, she would dictate her grocery lists and random thoughts into this little machine. My hands shook as I lifted it. The battery compartment was clean, and the device powered on with a faint chirp when I pressed the button. The tiny digital screen indicated there were several audio files saved to the internal memory. Jolene stepped closer, the silence in the storage unit pressing down on us like a physical weight. I pressed play on the most recent file. First, there was a burst of static, followed by the heavy, labored sound of my grandmother breathing. Then, her voice filled the dusty air. It was frail, thinned out by age and illness, but the clarity of her mind was absolute. Hearing her speak after 7 months of crushing grief and relentless family warfare felt like a physical blow to the chest. "It is Tuesday," her recorded voice rasped, pausing to catch a breath. "Randall brought more papers today. I told him I am too tired to read them. He just leaves them on the bedside table and stares at me. I do not believe in that lodge. I never did. It is a bottomless pit, and he wants to drag me down into it with him." There was a long pause on the recording. I could hear the rustle of bedsheets, the sound of someone shifting in physical pain. Then, she spoke again, her tone shifting from exhaustion to a fierce, protective clarity. "I need to say this out loud so someone finds it. Amelia has not taken a single penny from me. She only brings me tea and helps me wash my face. Randall is lying to the bank. He is lying to me. If my accounts are empty, it is because my son took the money while I was asleep." The audio file ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood frozen under the flickering fluorescent bulb of the storage unit, staring at the small silver device in my palm. This completely transformed the nature of the war. This was no longer just a complex case of financial fraud and forged signatures. This was a profound, nauseating betrayal of flesh and blood. My father had not just stolen from a confused woman. He had systematically terrorized a lucid, bedridden mother who knew exactly what he was doing but simply lacked the physical strength to fight him off. He had preyed on her physical decay. I did not waste another second. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and immediately recorded a digital backup of the audio directly onto my secure cloud drive. Then, I drove straight from the storage facility to the downtown office of my attorney, Sloan Pike. I bypassed the receptionist, walked into her office, and placed the physical recorder in the center of her glass desk. I instructed her to lock it in the fireproof safe and log it as official evidentiary material. I could not risk my father finding a way into my apartment and destroying the only piece of physical proof that carried Beatrice's own voice. When I finally left the law firm, the late afternoon sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, cold shadows across the pavement. I unlocked my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and shut the door. I put the key in the ignition, but I did not turn it. I just sat there, gripping the leather steering wheel. For 7 months, I had been running on pure adrenaline and survival instinct. I had absorbed the vicious rumors, the dirty looks at church, the passive-aggressive social media posts, and the subtle threats to my career. I had compartmentalized the pain, focusing entirely on forensic accounting, metadata, and expired notary seals. I had forced myself to be a machine because showing any emotion would have been interpreted by the town as a confession of guilt. But sitting in the quiet isolation of my car, the machine finally broke. The sound of Beatrice's frail, terrified voice echoed in my head. I thought about her lying in that sterile recovery bed, knowing her own son was waiting like a vulture for her to close her eyes. I thought about how she had used her last ounces of energy to speak my name into a piece of plastic, desperately trying to shield me from the very trap I had ultimately fallen into. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and wept. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a violent, rib-cracking release of grief, anger, and absolute heartbreak. I cried for the grandmother who died terrified. I cried for the 9 years of my 20s that I had sacrificed to prop up a man who hated me. I cried until my throat was raw, and there was no moisture left in my eyes. I stayed in that parking lot for nearly 2 hours. When I finally lifted my head, the sky was pitch black. I pulled the rearview mirror down and looked at my reflection. My eyes were bloodshot, and my face was pale. But the overwhelming weight of the panic was completely gone. As I finally turned the key and the engine roared to life, my objective crystallized. I was no longer interested in simply clearing my name. Proving my innocence was a defensive maneuver, and I was done playing defense. The truth was no longer a shield. It was a weapon. My parents had carefully orchestrated a public tribunal for Thanksgiving. They had invited 30 people to watch me break. I realized then that I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to attend that dinner. I was going to sit at that table. But when the time came, I was not just going to show the family a stack of bank statements. I was going to force my mother and father to sit in dead silence and listen to the recorded voice of the woman they had tortured and robbed. I was going to make them look into the eyes of their siblings and cousins while Beatrice spoke from the grave. Proving my innocence was not enough. I was going to ensure that Randall and Patrice Simmons never showed their faces in Belmere County again. The final 48 hours before Thanksgiving were stripped of all emotion. The paralyzing panic and the crushing grief had entirely burned out of my system, leaving behind a cold, operational clarity. I was no longer a daughter trying to survive a family dispute. I was an architect finalizing the blueprints for a demolition. My first stop was the downtown office of my attorney, Sloane Pike. Sloane did not deal in emotional hand-holding. She dealt in tactical strikes. I sat across from her heavy mahogany desk. The raw materials of my defense spread out between us. Our objective was simple. We had to compress weeks of dense financial forensics and complex legal jargon into a weaponized dossier that 30 ordinary people could comprehend between bites of turkey and mashed potatoes. We were not preparing for a courtroom with a judge. We were preparing for a dining room filled with aunts, uncles, and cousins who possessed notoriously short attention spans and a deep-seated bias against me. Sloane was meticulous. She slid a heavy, reinforced manila envelope onto the desk and began dictating the order of operations. We built the package backward, starting with the most undeniable visual evidence. Exhibit A was the cash flow map Mara had designed. It was printed in high-resolution color, showing the thick red lines connecting my grandmother's drained savings directly to the commercial vendor accounts of the wedding venue. Exhibit B was the forensic breakdown of the forged power of attorney, featuring a side-by-side microscopic comparison of the signatures. The metadata timestamp proving it was created on my father's home computer, and the bright red confirmation that the notary seal was dead months before the document was stamped. Exhibit C was a terrifyingly simple chart contrasting the fake invoices from the non-existent contract nurse with the official state nursing registry database showing 0 results. Exhibit D contained the photocopied pages of the hospital timesheets and the rehabilitation center's visitor logs, proving my physical absence on the days I allegedly coerced a dying woman. Finally, Sloane placed a small, encrypted digital thumb drive into a plastic sleeve and secured it to the back of the folder. It contained the clean, enhanced audio file of Beatrice's final confession. But Sloane knew that handing a stack of complex forensic reports to a room full of panicked relatives would only cause chaos. They needed a translator. Together, we drafted a single, stark summary page to sit at the very top of the stack. It was written in ruthlessly plain English. No legal statutes, no accounting terminology. It consisted of 5 simple bullet points detailing exactly who stole the money, where the money was currently sitting, and how the paper trail had been manufactured to frame me. It was designed to be absorbed in less than 60 seconds. If my father tried to shout me down, the summary page would do the talking for me. I drove home with the manila envelope resting on my passenger seat. It felt as heavy as a cinder block. The confirmation that my father had carefully choreographed this upcoming slaughter arrived later that same afternoon. My phone rang, and the caller ID displayed Aunt Darlene's name. I answered, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Darlene sounded frantic, complaining loudly about the logistics of the holiday meal. She was stressed because she had to rent extra folding chairs at the last minute. When I casually asked why she needed more seating, she let the truth slip completely by accident. Randall had spent the last week making personal phone calls. She grumbled, her voice strained over the sound of running tap water. He had explicitly invited second cousins from 3 counties over, great uncles who had not attended a family holiday in 5 years, and even the retired pastor from Grace Fellowship. He had told them all that this Thanksgiving was going to be a historic moment of family accountability and that their presence was absolutely mandatory. I thanked Darlene for her hard work and ended the call. A grim smile touched my face. My father was not just looking for a private confrontation. He was selling tickets to the circus. He wanted maximum exposure. He needed the largest audience possible to witness my humiliation, so that the resulting shame would guarantee my permanent silence. As if on cue, a text message from my mother materialized on my screen an hour later. It was a masterpiece of psychological projection. The message read, "Please just come to dinner quietly tomorrow. Do not make this into a bigger ordeal than it already is. Our family has suffered enough." I stared at the glowing letters. The audacity was almost breathtaking. She was actively setting the stage for my public execution, while simultaneously begging me not to scream when the blade came down. It was the ultimate confirmation that the script had already been written, memorized, and distributed to the leading actors. I deleted the message without replying. At 11 o'clock that night, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my brother, Owen. When I answered, the line was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him taking deep, shuddering breaths. When he finally spoke, his voice was a thin, fragile reed, but the core of it was solid steel. He told me he knew exactly what our parents were planning to do when everyone sat down to eat. He had watched our father pacing in the hallway, rehearsing his speech of righteous indignation. "I am not going to let him do it," Owen whispered into the receiver. "If he stands up tomorrow and points his finger at you in front of the whole house, I am standing up too. I will tell them about the blank printer paper. I will tell them about the forged signatures. You are not doing this alone." I closed my eyes, feeling a profound rush of gratitude. I told him to just stay calm, to let our father speak his piece, and to wait for my signal. The alliance was finally cemented. I spent the final hours before dawn sitting at my kitchen island. The house was completely silent. The only source of light was the small pendant lamp casting a warm glow over the manila envelope resting on the marble countertop. I drank a glass of cold water and simply looked at the package. I understood the absolute finality of what was going to happen in 12 hours. Once I pulled that flap open, there was no going back. There would be no tearful reconciliations in the future. There would be no awkward but polite birthday dinners, no shared holidays, no pretending that we were just a deeply flawed but loving family. Opening that envelope felt like cutting my parents out of my life with a dull, rusted blade. I was about to separate myself from them in front of 30 witnesses, but as I ran my fingertips over the rough paper of the folder, the terror of that realization was entirely eclipsed by a profound, unshakable sense of peace. I was going to lose my family, but I was going to get my name back. I was going to step out of the suffocating shadow of their debts and their lies. The cost of my freedom was astronomical, but I was finally ready to pay it. When the sun came up on Thanksgiving morning, I did not rush. I took a long, hot shower. I dried my hair and pulled it back into a simple, severe clip. I opened my closet and bypassed the colorful holiday dresses and the soft, approachable sweaters I usually wore to family gatherings. I was not going to a party. I chose a pair of tailored black slacks, a crisp white blouse, and a structured navy blazer. I applied minimal makeup. I wore zero jewelry. No earrings, no necklaces, nothing that would catch the light or distract the eye. I looked exactly like a woman walking into a corporate boardroom to terminate an employee. I did not want to look like a victim seeking sympathy, and I did not want to look like a defensive suspect trying to win over a jury. I wanted to look like the inevitable, undeniable truth. I grabbed my keys, picked up the heavy manila envelope, and slid it directly into my large leather tote bag. I walked out of my apartment, locked the door behind me, and stepped into the crisp autumn air. I got into my car and drove toward Alder Creek in total silence. I did not need to rehearse what I was going to say. I was not arriving to perform a monologue. I was arriving to end a war. The plates holding the remnants of the roasted turkey and mashed potatoes had barely been pushed aside when the suffocating tension in the room finally snapped. Randall stood up from his chair at the head of the table. He did not tap his glass. He did not raise his voice to a shout. He simply projected his polished, authoritative tone over the 30 relatives gathered in the dining room, declaring that it was time to address the elephant in the room. He pointed his finger directly at me and announced that I had stolen exactly $92,400 from his dying mother, with a theatrical sigh. He tossed the pristine white envelope across the table. It slid over the polished oak and came to a halt right next to my water glass. He called it a formal lawsuit for asset recovery, claiming he had filed it with the county out of a heartbreaking sense of duty. I picked up the envelope and tore the flap open. I pulled out the crisp pages, letting my eyes scan the text for a mere 5 seconds. It was exactly what I had anticipated. It was a terrifyingly formatted piece of fiction. There was no assigned case number printed at the top. There was no intake stamp from a court clerk. The margins were entirely wrong, and the legal statutes cited were practically copied and pasted from a generic internet forum. I did not raise my voice. I did not aggressively defend my character. I simply placed his fake lawsuit face down on the table, looked directly into my father's eyes, and asked a single, quiet question. "Do you want the whole family to see the real file, Dad?" Before he could process the shift in my demeanor, I reached down to the heavy leather bag resting against my ankle. I pulled out the thick manila envelope, heavily bound and secured with a string tie, and dropped it onto the table directly beside his fabricated document. The dull thud it made seemed to echo against the walls. I opened the flap and pulled out 30 copies of the summary page Sloan and I had drafted. I handed the stack to my cousin sitting to my left and told her to pass them down. Then, I pulled out the first piece of hard evidence. It was the high-resolution cash flow map. "The money did not vanish," I stated, my voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the room. "And it certainly never entered my bank account. If you look at the diagrams in front of you, you will see exactly where Beatrice's life savings went. The funds were wired in structured batches to cover overdue vendor debts, emergency cooling system repairs, and imported crystal chandeliers for the Cedar Lantern Lodge." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the 3 long tables. Uncle David, sitting near the far end, adjusted his reading glasses and stared at the red lines connecting his mother's bank account directly to Randall's commercial enterprise. Randall's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He slammed his hand flat against the table, demanding I stop spreading forged nonsense. I ignored him entirely and pulled out the second document. It was the forensic breakdown of the durable financial power of attorney. I passed the copies down the line. "My father claims he had legal jurisdiction over her accounts," I continued, my tone as clinical as a surgeon reading a chart. "But the document he submitted to the probate court is a fabrication. The forensic report you are holding proves that the digital file was created on the desktop computer in Randall's home office exactly 2 months after Beatrice was already dead. Furthermore, the notary public whose seal is stamped on that page had an expired commission. The stamp was dead long before the document ever existed." Patrice let out a high-pitched, warbling cry, trying to deploy her tears to drown out the facts. But nobody was looking at her. 30 pairs of eyes were glued to the expert metadata analysis in their hands. "And as for the story that I manipulated her into handing over cash while we were alone," I said, pulling out the third stack of papers. "My father claimed I locked myself in her room on 2 specific dates. The papers coming to you now are the visitor logs from Maple Haven, alongside my official geolocated hospital timesheets. On the exact days I supposedly robbed my grandmother, I was working a 14-hour emergency shift at the hospital. I was not even in the same zip code. Furthermore, Those medical invoices you have all been hearing about from a nurse named Sharon Vale are entirely fake. That nursing license belongs to a retired pediatric therapist who lives 3 states away. The dining room was paralyzed. The aunts and uncles who had spent the last several weeks avoiding my gaze were now staring at my parents with expressions of dawning, visceral horror. Randall opened his mouth, desperately searching for a charismatic lie, a way to spin the paper trail, but I did not give him the oxygen. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out the digital voice recorder, and set it to maximum volume. I pressed play and set it in the center of the table. Through the faint static, Beatrice's frail, exhausted voice filled the dining room. Every person present immediately recognized the raspy cadence of the family matriarch. They sat frozen as they listened to her explicitly state that Randall was relentlessly harassing her for the lodge money, that she did not trust him, and that I had never taken a single penny from her. Hearing a dead woman testify against the son who robbed her was the kill shot. The audio file ended with a sharp click, leaving behind an asphyxiating silence. Suddenly, the chair to my right scraped violently against the hardwood floor. My younger brother, Owen, stood up. He was pale, shaking, but his voice was loud and clear. He looked at our aunts and uncles and confessed that he had walked into the home office late one night. He told them, fighting back tears, that he had personally watched our father printing out dozens of blank sheets of paper and practicing tracing Beatrice's signature over and over again. Before Randall could scream at his own son, Jolene Mercer reached into her oversized purse. She pulled out the small, blue spiral notebook and tossed it onto the table. It slid right over Randall's fake white envelope. She announced it was Beatrice's personal expenditure log, hidden away because she was terrified of her own son. The entire illusion shattered at once. Randall tried to counterattack, shouting about family loyalty and business investments, but his words were frantic, disjointed, and desperate. The more he yelled, the more guilty he looked. The absolute end came not from me, but from Aunt Darlene. She looked up from the cash flow map, her face twisted in pure disgust. She looked directly at my mother, who had slumped down in her chair, covering her face. "Patrice," Darlene asked, her voice shaking with rage, "why did my mother's end-of-life care money pay for a chandelier and back taxes at your wedding venue?" Patrice had no answer. She just sobbed, but this time, the tears were real. They were the tears of a woman who knew she was entirely exposed. The physical shift in the room was immediate. The relatives sitting near the head of the table pushed their chairs back, physically distancing themselves from my parents. The whisper network that had been designed to destroy me had instantly turned its devastating focus onto the true architects of the crime. The white envelope my father had dropped like a bomb was now nothing more than a pathetic joke. I did not gloat. I did not demand an apology. I simply stood up, picked up my leather bag, and walked out of the dining room. I walked out of the house and stepped into the freezing November night. The silence that followed me out the door was heavier and more profound than any screaming match could have ever been. In the weeks that followed that Thanksgiving, the fallout was absolute. Armed with the forensic dossier, Sloan froze the entire estate, triggering a massive fraud investigation. Faced with the reality of prison time for embezzlement and forgery, Randall capitulated entirely. To keep me from handing the entire file over to the district attorney immediately, he was forced to liquidate his remaining assets, refinance the commercial debt at a catastrophic loss, and formally release my name from the guarantee. I was finally free. The Cedar Lantern Lodge eventually folded, and my parents became pariahs in Belmere County. That Thanksgiving dinner became the permanent dividing line in our family history. It was the exact moment 30 people realized that the true thief was never the quiet daughter sitting in the middle of the room. The thief had been standing proudly at the head of the table from the very beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy family drama. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, hit that like button, and support the channel by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people who might need a reminder to always stand up for the truth.